The sun came up like a wound reopening over the desert. Light spilled across the basin in long, colorless bands, crawling over dead mesquite, broken fence posts, and the bones of a mule half buried in dust. The wind had not yet started. It would come later, dragging sand against window shutters and teeth. But for now the morning held its breath. Jonah Halle rode in from the east. His hat brim pulled low, his bay marais stepping carefully through rutted earth hardened by months without rain. He sat loose in the saddle, not slouched, not stiff, just balanced, as if he'd been born between leather and sunburn. The rifle scabbard thumped softly against the horse's flank with each step. He paused at the rise, overlooking the town, Caldera. Crossing lay below like a thought someone had abandoned halfway through. Buildings leaned into each other in tired conspiracies. A crooked church steeple listed westward. The stockyard fence sagged under its own weight. The only place that seemed alive was the saloon at the center, its false front facade freshly painted in red that already peeled like scabbed skin. A freight wagon creaked past the well, two oxen dragging their shadows through dust. A man stood beside the hitching rail outside the sheriff's office, spitting into the dirt with slow, ceremonial patience. Jonah watched the town without expression. His mare flicked an ear, sensing his hesitation. He nudged her forward. By the time he tied up outside the livery, the heat had begun its daily climb. The air smelled of manure, dry timber, and the metallic promise of trouble that seemed to hang in towns. Built too quickly, the stable boy came out wiping his nose on his sleeve. He was small and hollow-cheeked, eyes too old for the freckles scattered across his face. "Need feed and water?" the boy asked. Jonah nodded and dismounted. His boots hit the ground with a muted thud. He handed over the reins without speaking and reached into his coat, producing 2 coins. The boy stared at them as if they might disappear if he blinked. "Brush?" "Her down," Jonah said. His voice carried a rasp like gravel dragged through cloth. "Yes, sir." Jonah lingered a moment, resting his palm against the mare's neck. She leaned into it faintly, sweat darkening her hide where the saddle had pressed all morning. He removed his rifle, slung it across his back, and turned toward the street. The saloon doors swung open before he reached them. Laughter spilled out loud, brittle and slightly forced. Piano keys stumbled through a tune that had forgotten how it began. Inside, the room smelled of whiskey, smoke, and men who had learned to measure their lives in losses. A handful of gamblers hunched over cards. 2 cattle hands argued in low, dangerous voices near the bar. The bartender polished glasses with an expression suggesting he had once believed in things and no longer did. Jonah stepped to the counter. "Coffee," he said. The bartender eyed him, taking in the weather-stained coat. The dust caked along his cuffs, the holster worn smooth from use. He poured from a dented pot and slid the mug across. "You passing through?" the bartender asked. "Maybe." The man nodded like he'd expected nothing else. Jonah lifted the mug. The coffee tasted like burnt bark and regret, but it was hot. And that was enough. From the far side of the room came raised voices. Chairs scraped. Someone laughed too loudly, the sound cutting sharp as broken glass. Jonah didn't turn immediately. He let the moment build around him. The way storms gathered behind mountain ridges. Then he glanced over his shoulder. 3 men stood near the rear hallway leading upstairs. One wore a sheriff's badge pinned carelessly to his vest. He was thick-necked, with small eyes that seemed permanently narrowed against suspicion. His hat sat pushed back, revealing hair slicked flat with oil. Sheriff Lyle Bragg. Though Jonah didn't yet know the name, the other 2 men flanked him like shadows, one tall and hollow-faced, the other short and broad with a gambler's fingers. Drumming against his belt, between them stood a woman. She wore a plain traveling dress, once blue but now dulled by road dust. Her wrists were bound loosely in front of her with rawhide. She held herself straight despite it, chin lifted not in defiance but in refusal to fold. There was dried blood along her temple, partially hidden by dark hair that fell loose over one eye. "Lawful seizure," the sheriff was saying. "Debt unpaid. Property transferred." "She ain't property," said the bartender quietly, not loud enough to be heard across the room. The tall deputy laughed. The woman's voice came then, steady but worn. My father settled that land before you were born, Bragg. The deed. Burned in the courthouse fire? Bragg interrupted. Tragic thing. Paper don't last. Authority does. He gestured toward the staircase. We got buyers coming through tonight. You best keep your dignity until then. Might fetch you a better price. The room shifted uneasily. Cards were lowered but not abandoned. Whiskey glasses paused midair. Nobody spoke. Jonah turned back to his coffee. He drank it slowly, the heat tracing down his throat, settling somewhere deep and familiar where anger had long ago learned to live quietly. The auction notice hung outside the general store, nailed crooked against sun-bleached wood, settlement of outstanding debts, livestock, equipment, and one contracted domestic servant. The word servant had been scratched into the paper after the fact. Ink darker, letters pressed harder, like someone trying to force the word to hold weight it could not bear. Jonah read it while chewing on a strip of jerky. A fly landed on the page and crawled across the lettering before lifting off again. Behind him, wagon wheels rattled past. A church bell rang once, then thought better of it. You planning to bid? The voice came from the shade beside the storefront. Jonah turned. An Apache man sat cross-legged against the wall, wrapped in a faded army blanket despite the heat. His hair was streaked with gray, braided loosely. His eyes, dark and steady, reflected the street without appearing to focus on it. Jonah studied him a moment before answering. No, the man nodded as if Jonah had said something longer. She is called Eliza Ward, the Apache said after. A pause. Her father died last winter. Fever took him. The sheriff loaned them grain and seed at interest that grows like weeds. When she could not pay, he took the land. When she fought him in court, the courthouse burned. Strange fire. Only records tied to Bragg's holdings were lost. Jonah remained silent. I have watched 3 days, the Apache continued. She does not cry. That troubles them. Jonah shifted his weight. Why tell me? The Apache turned his head slightly, studying him now. Up close, Jonah saw the man's left ear was torn nearly in half, scar tissue puckering the edge. Because you carry ghosts that lean forward when cruelty speaks. Jonah's jaw tightened faintly. The Apache smiled without warmth. Let me feel. Everything, the Apache said quietly, his gaze drifting back toward the street as if listening to voices only he could hear. That is what my wife told me before soldiers burned our winter camp. She said if I lived with only rage, I would become smaller than those who took her from me. He paused, fingers brushing dust into idle patterns, and the cowboy was left. Speechless, he added, almost to himself. Jonah looked at him for a long moment. The town sounds pressed in hammering from the smithy, a child crying somewhere behind the church, the hollow rattle of wind finding loose shutters. What's your name? Jonah asked. Dakota. Jonah nodded once, then he turned and walked down the street. The auction took place at dusk. When the heat broke into a copper-colored haze that clung to skin and memory alike, lanterns were strung across the stockyard. Their light wavered in the rising wind, casting long, uncertain shadows that crossed and recrossed like nervous hands. Townsfolk gathered in loose clusters, speaking in low voices, some curious, others tight with shame they would later pretend not to recognize. Eliza Ward stood on a makeshift platform, beside a crate of farm tools and a thin milk cow whose ribs showed like ladder rungs beneath its hide. Her hands were still bound. Someone had cleaned the blood from her temple, though the bruise beneath had darkened into a spreading bloom. Sheriff Bragg stood before the crowd, ledger tucked beneath one arm. His deputies lounged nearby, rifles slung casually but ready. Jonah lingered near the back, hat low, arms loose at his sides. Dakota stood several yards away, blending into shadow as though the dusk had grown him from it. Bragg cleared his throat. Fine. Citizens of Caldera Crossing, he began, voice swelling with borrowed authority. We gather to settle lawful debts and ensure the continued prosperity of this territory. A murmur passed through the crowd. The cow shifted, hooves scraping wood, the tools sold first plows, spades, a rusted harrow going cheap to ranchers who avoided meeting Eliza's eyes. The cow fetched slightly more after a brief argument over her ability to calve again. Then, Bragg gestured toward Eliza, and now a contract labor agreement. Duration to be determined by purchaser within legal standards of this county. Eliza's gaze moved across the crowd, not pleading, not searching, just witnessing. Her eyes passed over Jonah without pause. She did not know him, and he gave. "No sign to be known. Do I hear $20? Bragg called. Silence stretched. The short deputy raised a hand. 20. Laughter rippled uneasily. The tall deputy called 30. A rancher with tobacco-stained whiskers offered 35, then immediately spat and looked at his boots as if regretting the sound of his own voice. 40, said the tall deputy, smiling at Eliza as though examining livestock. The wind rose slightly, stirring dust around their feet. A lantern guttered, then steadied. 50, Jonah said. The word landed soft but clear. Heads turned. Bragg squinted toward the back. "You got business here, stranger?" Jonah stepped forward, boots crunching gravel. "Just buying labor." A few men shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Bragg studied him, measuring height, posture, the calm weight of a man who neither hurried nor stalled. 55. The tall deputy said quickly. Jonah didn't look at him. 70, the crowd murmured louder now. $70 could buy a decent horse or keep a ranch running through a dry month. Bragg's smile thinned. "You certain you understand what you're bidding on, friend?" "Yes." A long pause followed. The deputies exchanged glances. The rancher with whiskers rubbed his chin, then shook his head, stepping back. 70 going once, Bragg said slowly. Dust swirled between them like a gathering storm. Going twice. The tall deputy opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed. It again sold. The gavel struck wood with a flat, final sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Jonah cut the rawhide from Eliza's wrists beside the stockyard fence. The crowd had already begun to disperse, conversation rising quickly as if people needed noise to bury what they'd witnessed. She flexed her hands slowly, wincing as circulation returned. "You don't look like a man needing a house servant," she said at last. "I don't." "Then what do you intend to do with me?" Jonah coiled the rawhide and tossed it onto a crate. "You can leave town in the morning." She studied him, suspicion mixing with exhaustion. "Why spend $70 on that?" He didn't answer immediately. He watched a line of ants navigate a crack in the fence post, each carrying fragments, larger than their own bodies. "Because you shouldn't be sold?" he said finally. Eliza's jaw tightened. For a moment he thought she might laugh or curse him or simply walk away. Instead she nodded once, as though acknowledging a debt she did not want. "They won't let me leave easy," she said. "I know." Trouble arrived just after midnight. The saloon had thinned to a handful of drunks and a single lantern burning low. Jonah sat at a table near the back, rifle leaning within reach. Hat tipped over his eyes, though. He was not asleep. Elisa sat across from him, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold hours earlier. "You don't talk much," she said. "Not much to say." She traced the rim of the cup with her finger. "You have family somewhere?" "No." The piano player struck a wandering chord, then another, before giving up entirely. Eliza glanced toward the door. "Bragg won't take losing lightly, I know." "You could ride out now," she said quietly. "Leave me money, I'll manage." Jonah opened his eyes. They were pale gray, the color of stormlight reflected off dry stone. "I already paid," he said. The doors burst inward. Bragg stepped through with his deputies and 2 other men Jonah hadn't seen before, range hands by the look of them, hired muscle with uncertain loyalty. "Evening," Bragg said pleasantly. Though his hand rested near his revolver, the remaining patrons slipped out quickly, chairs scraping, boots thudding. The bartender retreated behind the counter, polishing the same glass with renewed focus. "Contract disputes require review," Bragg continued. "I've reconsidered the legality of this transaction." Jonah leaned back slightly in his chair. "You had your chance." Bragg's smile sharpened. "You don't understand jurisdiction. That girl owes labor to this county. You interfered." Eliza stood slowly. "You burned my father's records." Bragg ignored her. "You'll hand her over," he said to Jonah, "and I'll let you ride out with your purse intact." Silence filled the room like rising water. Jonah placed his hat on the table beside him. The motion was careful, almost respectful. "No," he said. The tall deputy drew first. The shot shattered a whiskey bottle behind the bar as Jonah flipped the table, wood splintering under gunfire. Eliza dropped behind a support post. The bartender screamed and vanished through the kitchen door. Jonah moved with brutal efficiency. Not fast for show, but fast enough. His revolver barked twice. The short deputy spun sideways, crashing into a chair. One of the hired hands stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. Bragg fired, grazing Jonah's upper arm. The impact spun him partially around, blood darkening his sleeve. Jonah hit the floor, rolled, and fired again. Bragg's hat flew off as the bullet tore through the crown. The room filled with smoke, and the acrid stink of spent powder. Dakota appeared in the doorway behind Bragg, silent as drifting ash. A tomahawk flashed once. The remaining hired hand collapsed without a sound. The tall deputy lunged toward Eliza, grabbing for her dress. She drove her knee upward, catching him square. He doubled over. Jonah's next shot ended him then there. Was only Bragg, crouched behind an overturned chair, breathing hard, eyes wild. "You think you're righteous?" he spat. "This town runs on men like me." Jonah rose slowly, blood seeping down his arm, revolver steady. "No," he said. "It runs in spite of you." He fired once more. They left Caldera Crossing before dawn. The town behind them shrouded in dust, and the early murmurs of people who would spend years retelling the night with shifting versions of courage and blame. Dakota rode a paint gelding that moved with patient endurance. Eliza rode Jonah's spare mount, posture stiff but determined. Jonah rode one-handed, his wounded arm bound tight with strips torn from his shirt. They traveled west toward the foothills, where ranchers were fewer and the land answered mostly to sky. By midday they stopped beside a dry arroyo. Dakota gathered brush while Eliza cleaned Jonah's wound with whiskey that made him flinch only once. "You'll live," she said, tying the bandage firm. "I've been told that before," he replied. She studied him. "What happened to you?" He stared out across the flat horizon where heat shimmered like rising spirits. "I had a wife," he said after a long while. "And a daughter. Raiders came through during the winter drives. I was 2 days north selling cattle." He swallowed. "They burned the house. Neighbors found." He stopped. The wind carried a faint scent of sage from somewhere unseen. "I buried what was left." "Been writing since?" Eliza nodded, her eyes soft but unsentimental. "I'm sorry," she said. He inclined his head slightly as if accepting something too heavy to hold. Tieko returned with kindling. "The past is a canyon," he said, arranging stones for a fire. "You can shout into it forever and hear only yourself come back." They ate in quiet. The sun lowered, painting the desert in rust and gold. 2 weeks later they reached a valley north of the San Pedro River where abandoned homestead markers dotted the land like forgotten prayers. There was water there, thin but steady, and soil stubborn enough to grow if coaxed with patience. Eliza stood beside the remains of a collapsed cabin, hands on hips, studying the slope of the land. "I could make something here," she said. Jonah nodded. "You don't have to stay," she added. He looked toward the distant ridgeline, measuring distances only he could see. "I know," he said. Dakota smiled faintly. Already unpacking tools from the saddlebags, they worked through the afternoon, clearing debris, setting new posts, rebuilding what the desert had tried to erase. Sweat darkened their clothes. The air filled with the rhythm of hammer strikes and the low murmur of 3 people discovering the fragile geometry of shared purpose. At sunset, they stood before the skeletal frame of a cabin, beginning to remember its shape. Eliza wiped her brow with her sleeve. "I'll pay you back," she said to Jonah. "The $70. He shook his head. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. "You already did," he said, watching the last light settle across the valley. That night, as stars gathered in numbers too large to count, Jonah sat alone near the half-built porch. The wind moved softly through the grass, carrying the scent of water and new timber. Eliza stepped out behind him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You leaving in the morning?" she asked, probably. She nodded, though he could not see it. This place will remember you, she said. Jonah stared into the dark where the land fell away toward the river. He thought of ashes beneath snow, of small bones wrapped in blankets, of a voice long gone telling him stories about constellations that had names older than sorrow. Maybe, he said. They sat in silence until the cold deepened and the fire burned low. He left before dawn, as he always did, saddling his moray while the valley still held its breath between night and morning. Dakota watched from the cabin doorway, arms folded inside his blanket. You found something, Dakota said. Jonah tightened the saddle cinch. Maybe she did. Dakota nodded, accepting the distinction. Where will you go? Jonah mounted, settling into the saddle with a weary familiarity. West, he said. Dakota stepped aside as Jonah turned the moray toward the rising light. Remember, the Apache called softly, feeling everything does not make you weaker. Jonah paused, silhouetted against the first cut of sun breaking over the ridge. It keeps me from disappearing, he replied. Then he rode on. Years later, travelers passing through the San Pedro Valley would speak of a ranch built stubbornly from dust and grief, run by a woman whose handshake was firm and whose silence carried the weight of someone who had survived being priced and sold and still chose to plant seeds in unforgiving soil. They would speak, too, of an old Apache man who sat by the porch most evenings, telling children stories about stars and canyons and how the world remembers kindness long after it forgets gunfire.